So I guess my talk is really sort of summarising why all these previous lawyer talks and this massaging what we can do to make things better is all a load of crap. So I'm sorry. So I am using a bit of a case study of Ballina's koalas and the Pacific Highway upgrade for Section 10 and how all of these things, inadequate legislation, inadequate ecological assessments, deceptive offsets and power imbalances have cheated Ballina's koalas and all of our biodiversity. So it's not just about the koalas. We had 38 threatened species that lived in Section 10 of the Pacific Highway upgrade. So just to summarise quickly, inadequate legislation, it's complicated by a history of legislation. The Threatened Species Act actually worked, and it worked so darn well, and I was a threatened species officer when it first came in, and I actually helped John Gibbons write it, so I know it was good. But the developers didn't like it. The consultants were getting paid. Some of them were like, I pricked one in the leg one day with a paper clip because he stood up in a thing and said to the developers, I'll be whatever you want me to be. And I went, you're a prostitute? You know, like, I mean, this is the reality, was that it wasn't the words that were written in the legislation, it was how they were applied. So is it going to have a significant impact on a threatened species? They would just say, no, it's not. Like just rephrase the question back as a response, and that isn't good enough. And all it ended up doing was, I remember one day when they were doing the first review of the Threatened Species Act, and we had that merging of EPA with national parks, and Simon Arthur Yarwood Smith said, don't you get it, Maria, that if you keep this up, there will be no Threatened Species Act? Right? And then we ended up with this watered down, morphed version, then we ended up with the Biodiversity Conservation Act, and everything just, because if you are tough, they don't like it. So in the end, everything just enabled the destruction of habitat. It's undermined by exemptions or variations, as Sue was talking about. And, you know, like even every time I write a submission, I write like, you know, I don't know what approving this development will mean because there's a 50-20 rule that allows a person to clear this habitat under the Rural Fires Act. So if you approve this, these trees that you think you're saving may not even be able to be stopped from being cleared, you know? So there's all these things that have a lot we have to think about before we go further. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with Safe Ballina's Koalas campaign, but it started in 2003 and is still kind of going on various levels. So Ballina has an important population. We had the pre-route selection ecological assessments. So Section 10 is 13 kilometres of 155 kilometres from Woolgoolga to Ballina. The community focus group that the RTA set up had great information, good ecologists, totally ignored the thousands and thousands of pages of information that people had to digest was just ridiculous, because a lot of it was just meaningless crap. And you had to try and pick what was worth reading out of it. It was aimed at dividing communities. So they did things like, oh, we can't go there because the Aboriginal people don't want it going through their land. Now, Jarlee Land Council had a letter that they'd given me saying they didn't care whether it went through their land as long as they were compensated for it. You know, they said, oh, SES don't want this because of the flood. This, you know, so they started pitting the farmers against, you know, everyone against everyone to divide the community. But in that pre-route selection, there was nothing about, like they said, yes, there's lots of records of koalas, but it never translated to anything beyond that. When they talked about the koala corridors and triggering of a species impact statement, that was for the populations to the south at Broadwater, at the National Park. They were at Tyndale, there was nothing about the corridors at Ballina. There was nothing beyond a few statements saying that they had records. So it was like, what about Ballina's koalas? We suspected what the route was, being quite vigilant. So at that point, before they'd selected the route, I left national parks so I could fight. You might think that this is like a great route selection. It's virtually all through cleared land. But that is when you have a difference between someone who understands a population and a consultant who's just there to do what their job is, for who's paying them. So the pre-approval ecological assessments, the EIS, the biodiversity sections were over 2,000 pages, and most of it was crap. The SIS was thousands of pages. There was minimal survey effort. So they'd gone out to do their assessments for the EIS, and at one of our critical points, which is that southern section, the landholder rang up and said, Maria, the RTA consultants have just been out here and they reckon I haven't got any koalas. Can you come out and have a look? And I went out and I said, oh, there's one there, there's one there, there's one there. There's one there. I said, no, he's still here. He's going, well, why didn't they find them? So he rang up the consultant that had given him their card, and they said, oh no, we went to where our dot is on the map of where we're doing the site. And Mick said, well, that's useless because that's not where the koalas are. But that was what they used to decide what level of avoidance measures they needed to apply. So therefore they didn't need to avoid, they could still stick their route where the shale was, which is what they wanted. It became a battle for shale or koalas. Unfortunately, the koalas like the rich soils that were on the shale. So that whole avoidance, mitigate and offset is just a joke, because it still comes down to what about Ballina's koalas? Oh, sorry. And the ambiguous language. So it's like it might have a, you know, there might be an impact, might be a potential adverse impact, there's like something could be possible, or you know, you have to really tighten up the language that's used. So we felt that it was basically a an experiment that they were going to be trialling with boundless koalas because there was no evidence or information to support that. We gathered because the government was, you know, the approval authority and the proponent, that it was likely that New South Wales government was just going to tick the boxes. So we thought that the only option we had was to lobby Greg Hunt as the Federal Environment Minister. Now, Greg Hunt approved the 155 kilometre route, but deferred section 10. And in deferring section 10, he required a population viability analysis and a special plan of management for boundless koalas that showed it wouldn't have a significant impact. In essence, there was to be zero harm to koalas. What zero harm to koalas ended up meaning was no direct impact, i.e. not run over by construction vehicles, not in a tree when it's felled, and things like that. So the PVA got prepared, and I'm just going to read a little bit of this. So the potential small adverse effects of the proposed could be reversed by the enormous potential to improve. So here we go, could, maybe, would, you know, none of these things that tell us anything. But the interesting one was the provision of additional koala-proof fencing, the provision of supplementary habitat after accounting for the loss of habitat for up to 5 koalas. We sat in a meeting when they presented this report, and one of the landholders said, there's more than 5 koalas impacted. No, we've worked out that the number of koalas per hectare is this, and the number of hectares of habitat impacted will be this. And another Mick, he said, I don't give a what number you've plucked out your arse, mate. Now, this is to RMS's ecologists that did the PVA. I don't care what number you plucked out your arse, mate. We can walk you down and we can introduce you to each of these koalas, and we know there's at least 25 that are on the route, and there's more that come in and out. So the PVA was flawed. It had biases because of the data that went in, and RMS wouldn't allow it to be more rigorous and over a longer period of time. They did kind of freak out when Linda Silmalis, who is LNP journalist for the Daily Telegraph, actually did this article, and she came out and she met these koalas, and she was like, what do they want about morale? And I'm like, well, you ask them. So it was, you know, like, then they started to lift their game and say, all right, well, what do we need to do? We then looked really carefully, much like Greg Hunt was going to refuse it and say, this is a significant impact, you've got to find another route. Bob Higgins, who was the project manager for RMS, when he got the approval, he said to me, I couldn't believe it. Like he said, I really thought we weren't going to get it. You put up a good fight. They kind of sacked Greg Hunt before he got to say no, and they shoved Josh Baby in. We got a lot of media attention, but Josh said that the highway upgrade would have a positive outcome for Balmain's koala population. The fact that he has said that, which is something I want to talk to Sue about later, was that now that I've got a really good solid base that it didn't have that, and we had all the Labor, Penny Sharp, Trish Doyle, all in there fighting for Balmain's koalas, what can we do to turn this around? It was arrogant, it was deceitful. They told us, we kept lobbying when Josh got put into the environment portfolio, only to find out, looking at the compliance report, that they already had approval a month and a half before. So rude and disrespectful to our community. So what did we get? We got 130 hectares of plantings. So those little pink areas are the plantings that we got, all up against the highway. We got grids so that koalas couldn't get from people's properties out onto the roads. We got connectivity structures, so they're the little yellow lines on this map here. We did pretty good. We got 26 over 13 kilometres, so reduced fragmentation, and we got all that fenced. That particular connectivity structure at the top, half of that is rotten when I was out there a few weeks ago. So again, you've got to be out there all the time and being a nag and going back and making sure they fix things. So we also got lots of studies. So we know that before the approval, Balmain's koalas were not inbreeding and didn't have inbreeding depression. We know that in the last study from the scats that they had a reduced diversity of genetic alleles. We don't know if that's because of the sample size or if it's something more sinister. So we need to get onto that and get them to do it properly, or for the government to give, someone who will do it properly, some funding to do it. One of the big things that's often underestimated with koalas is stress and the effect of stress. So I said that I was going to do, with I4, they were going to fund us to do a fecal cortisol study. RMS said, oh, you don't need to worry, we'll do that. I was like, okay, we can use that money for something else because it's not, we don't have a lot of money. So we got ring barking and tree collaring. And we had like a lot of trees collared in those, like two of the areas. You might ask, what is tree collaring? So tree collaring is part of what they call phased resource reduction. The resource being the trees. And if they collared those trees in a staged approach, then the koalas wouldn't be in them when they chop them down. So from February through to November of that year, the koalas progressively lost access to their food trees. In those areas, there weren't that many trees left for them to eat from. So what's a koala to do when they put these metal bands, so they could, if they were in the tree when it was collared, they could get out, but they couldn't get back up. I said to RMS, what are they doing? And they said, what do you mean? And I said, well, are they trying to get up? Well, I don't know. And I said, well, haven't you got cameras on them? And they said, oh, would you like cameras on them? Well, yes. So they put a camera on. I said, so what are the koalas doing? And they said, oh, now I found out they only had one camera on. I was like, no, you've got hundreds and hundreds of trees. You should have hundreds and hundreds of cameras. So they put 5 out. Most of those little reactions there of a koala trying to get up a tree were from a single male who, he was old, but he ended up with cystitis fairly quickly from the stress. He tried to get up several times a day sometimes. He was found dead at the base of a tree. Of a collared tree. He couldn't be classed as a victim of the tree collaring because I couldn't say for certain that he wouldn't have died anyway. I can say that it's almost certain that he died expending the last of his energy trying to get up and down the tree, and that it is highly unlikely that he just happened to be wandering past that tree and dropped dead at the base of it after being caught on film so many times trying to do this. The other one was a mother of Bellamina and Jug. So we lost Con to the tree collaring. Bellamina, and she was quite a classic. One of the approval conditions was that they weren't allowed to clear any trees with koalas in or within a certain distance. Bellamina's tree, a jacaranda fell over that was ring-barked and went into her favourite tree. She used the jacaranda and got in her tree. So then the consultants are going, oh, Maria, she's been in there for 3 days and we can't clear it. And I'm going stiff. I went and camped out there to make sure they didn't take her away without me knowing. I hear the Joey chirping this night. I go over. Bellamina's climbed back down the jacaranda up another tree for another 5 days. She kept going up to her Joey in the day and away at night to feed in the other trees that she could. She was a classic. Now, the RMS did their stress study of the scats, and this is what they found. So the blue line is our control site, which is out Tucky Way, and the orange line is the Laws Point site. Now, Sydney Uni geneticists, they know I'm not happy with them over this, wrote this report like it was like a year 12 first year uni student thing. They made an assumption that because the starting points and the end points of those were fairly similar, that there was no effect. Now, if you go to the number 3 here, where it starts to spike up, that's when 80% of the trees were collared. When you get to 4 and you get the next spike up, that's when 100% of the trees were collared. When it goes down, that's where we started taking out koalas that were diseased, so there were less koalas to have less stress levels. Now, when I first saw the trees collared, I lost it. I won't do what I did then, but it was pretty horrific. They wondered why I was so upset because I knew that they were doing this. But when I saw it, it was like this koala had this tree, this koala had that tree. So I knew who was losing their food. So when a koala is pretty stressed, it makes this noise. And you can see his belly.
Yes, yeah.
That's stress. So the tree collaring resulted in starvation. You can see trees with no leaves on. This is my little jug, and she was eating gum nuts because she was a joey and she couldn't even reach like the leaves and what leaves were left, so she was eating gum nuts. So this was macaweed. These trees used to be 20 metres high, but they chopped them down so that they could see having their construction vehicles go onto the alignment. As soon as they started resprouting, she would be in there. I took Ben Franklin out this day, and he's from the MLC, yeah, and he thought I'd planted her there. I said no. And he's like, how does she not get hit? And I said this, rang up the project manager and said, look, you know, macawees at the end of Third Gates Lane in the trees you chopped down. And he said, all right, we'll get a spotter and we'll block that lane off so none of their construction vehicles would use that lane that she was closest to. We ended up with disorientated koalas, dog attack, vehicle strike, and a lot of disease. So, best practice ecological assessments need to avoid ambiguous language. They need to provide robust assessment up front. You can't avoid impacts if you don't know what you're impacting. You need to demonstrate you understand how koalas are using a site, not just make standard comments. Standards for koala spotting, assessment, monitoring, adaptive management, or just avoid koala habitat. Again, you know, can we demonstrate that adequate avoidance and mitigation has been done? Can we illustrate that the impacts to the population and the individuals isn't, you know, can we? It's really hard because the consultants that make these decisions, like the tree collaring, that was one of the most respected and reputable koala ecologists in the country from UQ.
Because that wasn't us, Steve.
No,
Okay.
no. The person who was sitting in the EPA assessing the compliance with all these conditions was one of the consultants who was engaged to do the monitoring initially, and he said, oh no, you can't say we're not doing, you know. It's like, well, I can say that, sorry, you know, I will, and I'll prove it to you. Like,
She did do it.
But you know, like these things, so it's not just easy. The power imbalances, the developer-consultant relationship, the developer consent approval authority relationships, the expert panels that you talk about, you know, like Jonathan Rhodes was on the expert panel. He came up with this really rigorous monitoring and design and everything, and RTA said that will cost too much. He's one of the best koala statisticians out there. He didn't compromise on his statistics, you know, but what he came up with meant that in 15 years, I can be confident to a 70% level that the data that the consultants are collecting is right. So in 15 years, if it says like 90% of the koala population's going downhill, I can be 70% confident of that in 15 years. Well, I want to know now what's going on, not in 15 years. So take away the power. It has to be independent, but how we pick independence And who knows is the really hard thing. Community knowledge, and again, how do you know what these basics are? So it just keeps bringing me back to take away the power. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you.